Morning, my son knocked on my door. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. I didn't need, just for something to do with my hands. I saw him through the window before he saw me. 63 years old, and my heart still did that thing it does. That squeeze, that old reflex. 22 years. That's how long it had been. And there he was, standing on my porch like no time had passed at all. Like he hadn't looked me in the eye at his father's graveside and told me I was the reason Walter was dead. I set my mug down. I breathed. And then I opened the door. My name is Frances. I'm 67 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to be okay without my son in my life. I need to tell you how we got there first, because none of what happened this past year makes sense without it. Walter, my husband, passed from a heart attack in the fall of 2002. He was 58. No warning. He went to take the trash out after dinner and he didn't come back in. I found him on the side of the house, by the old oak tree he'd been meaning to trim for years. The paramedics said it was fast. I told myself that was a mercy, and I still tell myself that, even now. My son was 30 at the time. He and his wife, they'd only been married about a year, came down from Columbus for the funeral. I want to be fair here. Grief makes people say and do things that don't belong to them. I know that. But what my son said to me the night after we buried his father was not grief talking. It was something that had been sitting in him for a long time, and his wife had been tending to it like a fire. He told me that I had stressed his father out, that my spending habits had put a burden on Walter that contributed to his heart attack, that I had never appreciated what Walter built for our family. I stood in my own kitchen, the kitchen Walter and I had renovated together the year before he died, and I listened to my son say those things to me while his wife stood just behind him with her arms folded and a look on her face I will never forget as long as I live. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I said very quietly, I think you should go. He went. And for 22 years, that was that. I won't pretend those years were easy. The first 3 were the hardest. I would pick up the phone and put it back down more times than I can count. I drove to Columbus once, in the winter of 2004, and sat outside his apartment building for 45 minutes before I drove home without getting out of the car. I don't know what I expected. An apology, maybe. Just an acknowledgement that what he said wasn't right. It never came. So I built a life. I went back to work. I'd been a hospital administrator before I stepped back when my son was young, and I found a part-time consulting role that turned into something bigger than I expected. I made friends. Real ones, not the kind you inherit through a marriage or a neighborhood. My friend Cecilia, who I met at a grief support group in 2003, has been more family to me than most people who share my blood. I remodeled the house. I traveled. I went to Portugal by myself at 61 and ate sardines on the waterfront and felt genuinely and without guilt happy when Walter's life insurance finally cleared and I made some careful investments over the years. I found myself, at 66, in a position I hadn't planned for, but had worked quietly toward. Financially secure in a way that still surprises me when I look at my accounts. I sold the house Walter and I shared and bought a newer, smaller place in a good neighborhood, just enough space for me. A yard I can actually manage, a porch I actually use. I was not looking for anything to change. I was not lonely in the way people assume widowed women my age must be. I was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely settled. Which is exactly when my son showed up. He was standing on my porch with his wife beside him and 2 rolling suitcases between them. I noticed the suitcases first. I don't know why that detail hit me so hard. You don't bring luggage to an apology. I opened the door. I looked at him. This man I had not seen in 22 years, who had my husband's eyes and my own stubborn jaw. And I waited. He said, Mom. Just that. His wife. I'll call her what she was to me. Which was a stranger, smiled a smile that didn't reach anything above her cheekbones. She said, Frances, it's so good to finally meet you properly. We've heard so much. I thought, from whom? You've never spoken to me in 22 years. I said, you'd better come in. I made them coffee. I made it because my hands needed something to do, same as always, same as the morning my husband died, same as the morning I drove to Columbus and turned around in the parking lot. I have always needed my hands to be occupied when my mind is working too hard. My son sat at my kitchen table and explained, haltingly, that they were going through a hard time. His contracting business in Columbus had hit serious trouble. They had lost their lease on their apartment. His wife had left her job in the spring. He was vague about why, and they needed, just temporarily, a place to stay while they got back on their feet. He did not apologize for the things he said at his father's funeral. He said, "I know this is a lot to ask." He said, "I know we haven't been close." He said, "But you're my mother." His wife said nothing. She looked around my kitchen with the quiet, measuring gaze of someone doing an appraisal. I said I would need a few days to think about it. I told them there was a Marriott about 12 minutes down the highway, and I would cover 2 nights while I thought things over. My son started to say something about how they couldn't really, and I said, gently but in a way that was not a suggestion, 2 nights at the Marriott. I'll call you Friday. They left. I locked the door. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I did not move for a long time. I called Cecilia that evening. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Francis, who told him where you live?" I hadn't thought about that. I had moved twice since 2002. I had a different phone number. I was not on social media. I had not spoken to my son in 22 years, and he had not tried to contact me. Or if he had, I had not received it. And yet there he was, with 2 rolling suitcases, on my specific porch on a Tuesday morning. I said, "I don't know." Cecilia said, "Find out." I called a man named Richard. He runs a small investigative firm out of Durham that a colleague recommended years ago for some background check work I needed done for the hospital. He's discreet and thorough, and he charges a fair rate. I told him what I needed, everything he could find on my son's current situation, and everything he could find on the woman my son had married. He called me back in 9 days. My son's contracting business was real, but it had been failing for longer than a hard time suggested, tax liens going back 3 years, a civil judgment from a subcontractor in 2022, and a pattern of late filings that pointed to either serious disorganization or someone deliberately running the finances into the ground. Richard noted that the business accounts showed large transfers to a personal account he couldn't fully trace, but which appeared to be controlled by my son's wife. Her name, she had told my son and anyone who asked, was Sherry Vance. She had grown up in Dayton, she'd said. She'd worked in property management. Her real name was Teresa Kalowski. She had 2 prior fraud convictions, one in Michigan in 2009, one in Tennessee in 2016. Both involved elderly victims. Both involved real estate documentation and financial power of attorney. She had been married once before, briefly, and that husband had died under circumstances that were ruled accidental, but had been investigated. Richard told me this on a Thursday afternoon while I was sitting on my porch in the October sun, and I held the phone and I listened and I felt something settle over me that was not panic. It was closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when something you suspected turns out to be exactly what you feared, and now you know, and knowing means you can act. I said, "Richard, how did they find me?" He said my son had hired a locate service 8 months ago. He had been looking for me for a while, and had found my new address about 4 months before he appeared on my porch. 4 months. He had known where I lived for 4 months before he knocked on my door. He had known, and he had waited, and he had shown up with luggage. I thanked Richard. I told him to send me everything in writing. I called my son on Friday, as I said I would. I told him they could stay. I told him I had a spare room, and they were welcome to use it while they figured things out. I told him I was glad he'd come to me. He sounded relieved in a way that made my stomach hurt, because I couldn't tell anymore if it was real. They moved in the following Monday. I watched Teresa. I could not make myself call her Sherry, even in my head, carry her bags into the spare room, and I smiled. And I offered to help, and I noted everything. It started small. Suggestions, really. Teresa mentioned, casually, over dinner in the second week, that it must be a lot to manage a house this size alone. Had I ever thought about simplifying? Downsizing? She had worked in property management, she said. She knew the market, and this neighborhood was really quite valuable right now. It was a seller's market. I could walk away with a significant amount and put it somewhere easier to manage. She knew a financial advisor who specialized in situations like mine. I said, "That's interesting," and changed the subject. My son started asking questions about my finances. Not directly, he had enough sense for that, but sideways questions. "Mom, do you have someone who handles your accounts? And do you have a will set up? And have you thought about what happens to the house if something were to happen to you?" He framed it as concern. Maybe some of it was. I don't know. I think by that point my son was not entirely in control of the narrative he was living inside. In the fourth week, Teresa left a document on the kitchen counter. A power of attorney form, partially filled out. She said it had printed by accident. She gathered it up quickly and apologized and said she was helping a client. She still claimed to do freelance work, though I had never seen evidence of it. And she was sorry. It had gotten mixed in with her papers. I photographed it before she could take it. That evening, I called my attorney. My attorney is a woman named Catherine, who has handled my affairs for 11 years. I have never been more grateful for her than I was during those weeks. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon and laid out everything: Richard's report, the photographs, the conversations I had recorded on my phone. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. I had looked this up the day after Cecilia asked me how they'd found my address. Catherine listened. She read. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Frances, I want you to understand what you're looking at. This woman has done this before. She is organized, and she is patient, and she is counting on you to either not notice or not act." I said, "I noticed. I'm acting." Catherine said, "Good. Here's what we're going to do." What we did was this. We contacted the Raleigh Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Catherine had a contact there, and she made a call. A detective named, well, I'll just say Detective Harris, came to my house while my son and his wife were out one afternoon, and I showed him everything. Richard's documentation, the recordings, the power of attorney form, the timeline. He was thorough and he was kind, and he did not make me feel foolish for having let them in the door. He said in his experience it was often harder to act when the perpetrator was connected to someone you loved. He said that did not make it weakness. He said we would need to be careful about timing. We made a plan. The week before Thanksgiving, Teresa brought me another document. This one was a quitclaim deed, a form that, if signed, would transfer partial ownership of my house to my son. She presented it as something Walter might have wanted, something about protecting family assets, something she'd had drawn up by someone she trusted. She sat across from me at my kitchen table with her hands folded and explained it carefully, like I was someone who needed things explained carefully. I looked at the document. I looked at her. I said, "Let me read this over tonight." She said, "Of course." She said there was no rush. She said she just wanted to make sure I was protected. After she went to bed, I photographed every page and sent it to Catherine. And I texted Detective Harris, "Ready when you are." 3 days later, I told my son I had thought about the document, and I wanted to sign it. I said I had been thinking about what he said, about protecting family assets, and he was right. I said I wanted us to move forward. I watched something cross his face. I want to tell you it was guilt. I think some of it was, but there was also relief, and that relief told me what I needed to know about how deep in this he really was. Teresa was very warm that evening at dinner. She poured me more water without being asked. She asked about my garden. The next morning I told them I was going to run errands and that when I got back, we could sit down and go over everything together. I kissed my son on the cheek. He seemed startled. I hadn't done that in 22 years, and we both knew it. I did not run errands. I drove to Cecilia's house and I sat in her living room and I waited. Detective Harris and 2 other officers arrived at my home at 11:15 in the morning. They had a warrant. They had Richard's documentation, my recordings, Catherine's filings, and the prior conviction records from Michigan and Tennessee. Teresa Kalowski, was arrested that morning on charges of fraud, elder financial exploitation, and possession of fraudulent legal documents. There were other charges that came later as the investigation expanded, including a wire fraud element connected to the transfers from my son's business accounts. My son was not arrested that day. He was interviewed at length. He cooperated. He told investigators and later told me that he had known some of what Teresa was doing was wrong, that he had told himself it wasn't really fraud because I was family, that Teresa had convinced him I owed him something, that she had been telling him for years that I was sitting on money that rightfully belonged to him. He said he had not known about her prior convictions. Whether that is entirely true, I cannot tell you with certainty. What I can tell you is that it is consistent with what I know of my son, which is that he has always been capable of believing what is convenient. He was not charged, because he had cooperated fully, and the evidence of direct criminal intent on his part did not meet the threshold. He faces civil liability related to the business account transfers, which his attorney is sorting out. He called me from the hotel where he was staying. He left my house the day Teresa was arrested, and I have not asked him back. About 2 weeks later. He talked for a long time. He said things that were hard to say and harder to hear. He said I'm sorry more times than I could count, and toward the end I had to ask him to stop saying it and just talk to me like a person. We talked for 2.5 hours. I cried once, which I had not planned to do, and he cried more than once, which I think surprised us both. I did not tell him I forgave him. I don't think he expected me to, and I appreciated that he didn't ask. What I told him was that I was not interested in pretending the last 22 years didn't happen, and that if he wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would need to be built on something real, which meant it would need to be built slowly and carefully, and with a lot of patience from both of us. He said, "Okay, Mom." Not like the okay of a man who is agreeing because it's easier to agree. Like the okay of someone who understands there is work ahead and is willing to try. We're not there yet. I don't know if we'll ever be fully there. I talk to him about once a month now. It is careful and a little stiff and sometimes genuinely warm in ways that still catch me off guard. He's seeing a therapist, which I know because he told me without me asking, and I take that as a meaningful sign. What I want to say to you, whoever you are, watching this, maybe because something in the title felt familiar, maybe because you have your own version of the story sitting somewhere in your chest, is that getting older does not make you a safe target. It should not make you a soft one. I spent 22 years grieving a son and a future I thought I'd lost, and I am here to tell you that grief does not require you to abandon your discernment. When my son came back, every instinct I had that was built on love said open the door, and some part of that was right, but love does not mean you stop paying attention. Love does not mean you hand someone the keys before you know what they intend to do with them. I opened the door and I kept my eyes open at the same time. That's what I did. And it was the hardest and most important thing. My house is mine. My accounts are mine. My life, the quiet, full, hard-won life I built in the years my son was absent, is mine. Nobody got to take it. Not because I'm exceptional, but because I paid attention. And I had good people around me, and I did not wait for someone else to protect what was mine. Cecilia came over for Thanksgiving, same as most years. We made more food than we needed and ate on the good dishes, and she told me about a trip she was thinking of taking to Costa Rica and asked if I wanted to come. I said yes. I said yes without thinking about it, without weighing it, without the old heaviness that used to settle in when I thought about doing something good for myself. Just yes. That felt like something. It still does. People ask me sometimes if I regret opening the door that morning. I understand why they ask. From the outside, it probably looks like I took a risk I didn't need to take. That I let danger walk into my house and sit at my kitchen table and drink my coffee. And maybe that's true, but here's what I've come to believe. Sitting with all of it, what you do when you're afraid, tells you more about who you are than almost anything else. And what Teresa did when she thought she had me, that told me everything about who she was. There's a logic to how things unfold in life that isn't mystical or magical. It's just cause and effect, accumulated over time. Teresa had spent years building a particular kind of life, one where other people's trust was a resource to be extracted, where relationships were instruments, where the patience required to deceive someone was just another tool in the kit, that life had a shape to it, and that shape eventually became visible. Not because the universe punished her, because patterns repeat, because people who operate that way leave traces, and traces can be found by anyone willing to look. I was willing to look. That's what I keep coming back to. Not that I was smarter than her, or stronger, or more deserving of a good outcome. Just that I didn't let love make me passive. I let myself feel the pull toward my son. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. And I stayed careful at the same time. Those two things can exist together. It took me most of my life to understand that, but they can. My son made choices over 22 years that cost him his relationship with me. And then he made choices in those weeks in my house that could have cost him far more. He is living now with the weight of that. I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because it's real, and because I think pretending consequences don't land on people who deserve them doesn't help anyone. Not the person telling the story and not the person listening. What I want for the people watching this is simple. Trust your instincts, then verify them. Love people, then pay attention. Getting older does not mean getting softer about the things that matter. It does not mean your home, your finances, your hard-won stability are available for someone else to dismantle because they've decided they're owed something. You are allowed to be warm and watchful at the same time. You are allowed to say, "Let me think about it," to anyone, including your own children. You are allowed to call Richard and Catherine and Detective Harris and Cecilia. You are allowed to build a team of people who help you see clearly when the fog of old grief and old love makes it hard to see on your own. Frances didn't survive this because she was exceptional. She survived it because she remembered, at the moment that mattered most, that her life belonged to her. That's it. That's the whole thing. And if you take nothing else from this story, I hope you take that.